This is the story of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra's 100 years of educational programming and its groundbreaking legacy of community service through education. For over 2,000 years, the study of music has been considered an essential element in education. From ancient Greece to the present day, music has been valued as one of the four pathways called the quadrivium that are the basis of a liberal arts education. In the early 1920s, it was entirely natural for Dr. Rhees, the president of the University of Rochester and a theologian, to be thoroughly acquainted with the quadrivium, as is confirmed in this address given by Rhees in 1933. As a moral and secular advisor to Rochester's leaders, Dr. Rhees had a strong influence on how the great wealth acquired by George Eastman, the founder of the Eastman Kodak Company, could be put to work for the moral betterment of the community through the creation of an orchestra, which could be made a big factor in education. Believing that music and the arts are essential to education, Rhees encouraged Eastman to fund the creation of two major institutions. One, the Eastman Theater with its orchestra for the purpose of educating audiences, and two, the Eastman School of Music for the purpose of educating musicians. Although these two institutions had some overlapping concerns, they were entirely separate organizations financially and administratively. For the new Eastman Theater Orchestra, George Eastman set three goals, the three E's. The orchestra should entertain and educate the community, and the orchestra should earn its own way through the creation of a new model, which would generate income through daily community-wide ticket sales for programs featuring silent films accompanied by classical and popular orchestral music. The name Eastman Theater Orchestra was the first of the orchestra's three names over the following century. Under three different names, the orchestra would always have a core structure, consisting of a core of full-time professional musicians, which could be augmented with part-time players for the Classical Philharmonic series, or reduced in the number of players for performances of lighter music. Between 1923 and 1929, the Eastman Theater Orchestra varied in size from 65 to 70 full-time musicians. Ticket-buying audiences for the orchestra's daily programs were successfully attracted by the new medium of feature-length silent films, accompanied by orchestral music. The daily programs also included presentations of ballet and opera scores, as well as instrumental and vocal soloists performing classical and popular music. On 16 Thursday nights throughout the season, the Eastman Theater Orchestra would be augmented in size for the Philharmonic Series concerts. The Eastman Theater management was responsible for all of the Philharmonic operations and finances, but the additional expenses for the extra musicians and the Philharmonic music director were underwritten by Philharmonic subscribers. Shown here is the augmented orchestra for the first Philharmonic Series concert in 1923. Conducted by Eugene Goossens, who in 1925 assumed the position of music director. The conductors of the Eastman Theater Orchestra were separate positions from that of the Philharmonic music director. From the very beginning, and throughout the orchestra's history, the duties of the music director were primarily relegated to the Philharmonic series, which has always been a fraction of the orchestra's full concert season. The bulk of the Eastman Theater Orchestra's concerts were performed by the core orchestra, under its associate and assistant conductors Arthur Alexander in 1922, Vladimir Shabich in 1923, and Victor Wagner 1922 to 1929, who was largely responsible for the selection of music to accompany the silent films. The music directors for the Philharmonic series during the Eastman Theater Orchestra years were Albert Coates, 1924 to 1925, and Eugene Goossens, 1925 to 1931. Howard Hansen also conducted the Philharmonic Orchestra in his annual American Composers Concerts, which began in 1925 and continued regularly until 1971. Although the Eastman Theater Orchestra was successful through the silent film era, The advent of new talking movies caused the silent film market to collapse, along with the need to have a live orchestra to provide the essential emotional enhancement required for the silent films. Once again, in 1930, Rhees and George Eastman were the moving forces behind a bold plan to save the orchestra with the creation of the Rochester Civic Music Association. Under a new modified American model, the core orchestra would continue with the same musicians, but its name would be changed to the Rochester Civic Orchestra. Instead of being supported primarily by ticket sales, the core orchestra would also be managed by a new corporation, the Rochester Civic Music Association, consisting of thousands of community-wide individual and business memberships. The Rochester Civic Music Association would also assume responsibility for the operations and finances of the Philharmonic series. The costs for the augmented Philharmonic musicians would continue to be underwritten by Philharmonic subscribers. The most innovative and significant aspect of the Rochester Civic Orchestra's new mission was to conduct concerts of an educational character in the schools of Rochester, with the concerts to be broadcast on radio to the Rochester schools. In describing the new Civic Music Association, George Eastman said, "He did not believe that any city in America possesses an orchestra supported on such a city-wide basis, and with a plan of operation which will bring the group so intimately into contact with the city's inhabitants in their own neighborhoods." From 1930 to 1975, the Rochester Civic Orchestra presented regular educational concerts in Rochester area schools, in addition to continuing to serve as the core orchestra for the Philharmonic series. In 1930, the Civic Orchestra was presenting 32 free weekly educational concerts performed at 4 Rochester high schools. The concerts were also broadcast by radio to all Rochester city schools. By 1966, the educational programs were reaching tens of thousands of students through live concerts in the schools, as well as by radio and television broadcasts, and through LP recordings. From 1929 to 1951, Guy Fraser Harrison was the Civic Orchestra's associate conductor, responsible for the education and community programs, including the program in this photo, which was taken during an educational concert at Charlotte High School in the 1940s. While the majority of the Civic Orchestra's weekly educational and community concerts were conducted by the associate conductor, the position of music director continued to be dedicated almost exclusively to the Philharmonic series concerts. Paul White, a former violinist in the Eastman Theater Orchestra and a member of the conducting faculty at the Eastman School, also conducted occasionally as the Civic Orchestra's assistant conductor between 1929 and 1965, when Dr. Samuel Jones was hired as the Civic Orchestra's assistant conductor for the educational and community concerts, primarily because of his prior background in presenting orchestral education programming. The Rochester Civic Orchestra's music directors and interim conductors for the Philharmonic series were Fritz Reiner, 1931 to 1934, Jose Iturbi, 1936 to 1944, Sir Thomas Beecham, 1944 to 1945, Leonard Bernstein, 1945 to 1947, Erich Leinsdorf, 1947 to 1956, Theodore Bloomfield, 1959 to 1963, Laszlo Shomaji, 1963 to 1969, Walter Handel, 1968 to 1970, and Samuel Jones, 1970 to 1971. Howard Hanson also conducted the Civic Orchestra, which was augmented with Eastman faculty members under the name Eastman Rochester Orchestra for the annual American Composers Concerts. The augmented Rochester Civic Orchestra recorded under several names, including as the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, but also as the Eastman Rochester Orchestra, the Eastman Rochester Pops Orchestra, and the Rochester Orchestra. From its earliest days, the Civic Music Association relied on the dedicated support of community volunteers, especially the Women's Philharmonic Committee, which was formed in 1929. The Women's Committee promoted the Philharmonic series through annual ticket sales campaigns in the community and by hosting the pre-concert lectures. By the 1950s, the Women's Committee also supported the Civic Orchestra's educational activities through the sponsorship of annual youth festivals, in which students played side by side with the Civic Orchestra musicians, and through the creation of the Young Artist Awards for outstanding young musicians in the Rochester area. By the mid-1960s, the Women's Committee had created the RPO Education Advisory Committee to assist in planning and facilitating the RPO intermediate school concerts in the Eastman Theater. In 1970, the Women's Committee also created the Rochester Philharmonic Youth Orchestra, an expansion of the previous annual youth festivals. By the 1970s, the Rochester Civic Orchestra's 40-year-long commitment to educational and community-oriented programming had comprised roughly one-third to one-half of every orchestra season, including through the years of the Great Depression and World War II. By 1973, the orchestra's educational program consisted of a high school series, elementary school series, college seminars, RPYO concerts, and young artist auditions, radio broadcasts, and open Philharmonic rehearsals. In 1975, the Rochester Civic Music Association was reorganized, and its name was changed, largely influenced by the Philharmonic's music director Laszlo Somogyi, who as a refugee from the Hungarian Revolution wanted an orchestra more like the European model when he asked, "Why use two different names, Civic and Philharmonic, for one orchestra?" As one board member explained in the RPO News magazine, quote, "Very simply, the RPO is what we're all about," unquote. The Rochester Civic Music Association was renamed the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra Incorporated, and the Rochester Civic Orchestra's name was changed to the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. The same core musicians from the Civic Orchestra were now called the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, even when not augmented for the community and education concerts. These changes resulted in a modified European model, with an increased focus on serious classical music. In 1977, the Philharmonic series was expanded to add a second Saturday night performance to the regular Thursday series concerts. In 1981, the Women's Philharmonic Committee also changed its name to the Rochester Philharmonic League. A year later, in 1982, the RPO Incorporated revised its mission statement again to further embrace a modified European orchestra model. The orchestra's central purpose would be the presentation of symphonic and classical music, with a secondary purpose to present educational concerts. The main conductor of the Philharmonic Choir Orchestra from 1973 to 1987 was the RPO Associate Conductor Isaiah Jackson, who in addition to the orchestra's education and community concerts, also conducted the Promenade Pop series. One example of Jackson's groundbreaking community outreach can be seen in this photo, taken inside Attica Prison, where the orchestra gave a widely publicized performance for prison inmates. In 1985, Jackson also recorded the RPO's first educational LP record, an RPO Tiny Tots program titled My First Concert for preschoolers. From 1983 to 1986, Jackson's conducting responsibilities were shared with Enrique Arturo Demecq, whose position was underwritten by a grant from the Exxon Corporation. From 1983 to 1988, Erich Kunzel was the RPO's first principal conductor for the pop series, which usually required an augmented orchestra. In 1987, Peter Bay became the RPO Associate Conductor, assuming the responsibility for creating and conducting the RPO education and community programs until 1995, when he became the music director of the Austin Symphony in Texas. The position of RPO Principal Pops Conductor was filled by Jeff Tyzik in the 1993-94 season. Between 1996 and 1999, the education concerts were conducted by Dr. David Harmon. In the year 2000, Michael Butterman became the first Louise and Henry Epstein RPO Principal Conductor for Education and Outreach, the only position of its kind in the United States. The RPO positions of Music Director and Principal Conductor continued to be devoted almost exclusively to the Philharmonic series under David Zinman, Jerzy Semkov, Mark Elder, Robert Bernhardt, Christopher Seaman, and Ariel Remereit. In 2011, the RPO Incorporated revised its mission for the orchestra, returning to a modified American model with a restored emphasis on a broad range of quality music, while continuing to support the orchestra's educational activities. During the 2010-2011 season, the orchestra's educational programming was supported by $270,000 in sponsorships, along with education-specific grants, special fundraising events, and underwriting for the position of Principal Conductor for Education and Outreach. The full scope of RPO education programs in 2011 was studied by an RPO education planning team as part of a year-long RPO strategic planning process. The education team's final report outlined three main areas of the orchestra's education programming: school-aged concerts, community and family concerts and events, and resources for teachers. The report also listed three fundamental benefits that are realized by RPO education programming. 1. Individuals, families, and school districts receive high-quality services in support of national and statewide mandates in music education, to the end of enriching the lives of present and future generations. 2. RPO programs attract funding from sources outside of the Rochester community through national granting agencies and foundations. 3. RPO education programs constitute approximately one-third of the orchestra's season, thereby enabling the community to attract the highest level of professional musicians and conductors from all over the world through full-time employment. From 1975 to the present day, the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra has recorded frequently under RPO staff and guest conductors. A few examples of the recordings are shown here under David Zinman, Newton Wayland, Peter Nero, Erich Kunzel, Michael Palmer, Lalo Schifrin, Robert Bernhardt, and Jeff Tyzik. In 2018, and then again in 2020, under Ward Stair, the RPO's 12th music director, the RPO's mission was revised with a new emphasis on the continuing role of the RPO in community music education. In 2020, the RPO under Ward Stair received a Grammy Award in the category Best Contemporary Classical Composition for a locally produced CD featuring the Harp Concerto by Jennifer Higdon with Yolanda Condonasis as the soloist. Throughout the orchestra's history, the strong education mission of the Rochester Philharmonic has enabled the orchestra to retain its world-class musicians on a full-time basis, while at the same time enabling the orchestra to serve thousands of homes in the Rochester region through its children. The great pandemic of 2020 caused a worldwide reassessment of values and practices with virtually every organization and business, including the world's symphony orchestras. Fortunately, at the same time, new technologies have emerged in virtual education, which have enabled orchestras such as the Rochester Philharmonic to continue to serve their communities through the pandemic and beyond. From the very beginning in 1923, and over the decades ever since, Rochester's orchestra has served its audiences, young and old alike, with great music, not only classical music in its Philharmonic series, but also with opera and choral music, music for the ballet and modern dance, music from Broadway, jazz, folk, and gospel in its Pops concerts, and music for children in its Tiny Tots and education concerts. In 2021, as the Rochester Philharmonic nears its centennial under the orchestra's new music director, Andreas Delfs, and principal Pops conductor, Jeff Tyzik, the RPO is positioned to build on the orchestra's remarkable history and to continue to remain relevant for a future in Rochester filled with music for the entire community.